If those are not aware, UFC has now decided to leave from ESPN starting in 2026. They have partnered up with Paramount. They will be streaming both their not pay-per-views anymore, but marquee numbered events and their fight night events exclusively on Paramount Plus, and some will be airing on CBS, their marquee network, broadcast network, I should say. And the deal has been struck, or the deal has been announced this morning. No pay-per-views, Brother Smith. No more pay-per-views in the UFC. They are strictly going to air all of that content. So what do you think? First off, this is a monstrous deal. I believe the terms are 7 years, $7 billion, $7.7 billion over the span of that deal, meaning $1.1 billion per year on average. So first off, what do you see is the impact that this will have on pay-per-view rights, not just for MMA, but also for boxing, because we've been seeing that. And I believe Luke Thomas mentioned this when he was talking about the deal. Top Rank no longer has a regular TV deal. PBC doesn't have like a regular TV deal. Right. So what do you think is the impact of this particular deal, where there are no pay-per-views anymore? They're strictly going by their streaming deal. What do you think this impact will be on the landscape of combat sports as a whole?
Well, there might be the end of the pay-per-view model, period. It just is. I mean, if the UFC, which had been doing well with pay-per-views, decides to abandon that model, it kind of shows that it's a bit outmoded. $7.7 billion over 7 years, an incredible amount of money. For context, I think ESPN was $220 million or something like that. So what they've gotten is just extraordinary, considering, you know, the current landscape of media. And it's just the faith they have in long-term, consistent live sports for 7 years is worth a tremendous amount of money. It's one of the few things people, you know, pay to watch on time, in a sense, right? And it's the idea that they have faith in the UFC's brand for the next 7 years, which in media, as you know, is a long time. 7 years is forever. So the idea that they believe that the brand will still be strong in 7 years, coming off of 2025, that domestically in the United States, you know, I don't want to say it's kind of a down year, but, you know, you had one American champion. That was John Jones. We kept getting teased with the John Jones-Tom Aspinall fight. That never happened. And not a lot of marquee fights going on in 2025. And even then, they get $1.1 billion a year. It shows the strength of the brand. And I do believe that pay-per-view model is kind of going away, because a lot of people say, I'm already paying X per month for your platform, and now it's X more for a pay-per-view. And a lot of people just don't want to, you know, take that leap. Also, when you see it so many different ways, you know, through piracy and other stuff, that catch the highlights on YouTube the next day. So the idea that paying extra money to a lot of people wasn't worth it. And I think the UFC and Paramount recognized that, but it really says a lot about the strength of the UFC brand.
Yes, indeed. And I did want to also mention as well, I was very, very happy that it was one, I believe it was one pay-per-view, is which ESPN kind of butchered the pay-per-view. It's the way they had to put it on for free anyway. So I was very happy, because I was subscribed to ESPN Plus that time. So thank you for that, ESPN Plus. But I also want to add, you do mention that kind of with the lack of big name stars that we have right now, especially in the American sphere or on the American side of UFC, how do you think the numbered events, or the, I don't want to say pay-per-views because they're no longer
pay-per-views, the tentpole marquee events, we could say, yeah.
The marquee events, exactly. How do you think UFC is going to differentiate those from the fight night events, especially considering there's no real incentive? Do you think the UFC has an incentive to differentiate those events from the fight night events and to make those more special?
Yeah, I still think you do. I think you have those big cards you look forward to, and kind of the fight night events kind of are the snack before the big meal, right? You still need those tentpole events. I mean, when I was with Bellator, they did the same thing. They kind of like had these big events that you kind of, you know, marked on your calendar. You're going to need that. There's no way around that. It can't be, like the WWE, who I worked for before. They had their, WrestleMania, they had Money in the Bank, they had, SummerSlam, these big tentpole events. And in between that, you have SmackDown and Raw, which, you have for free every week. So, yeah, pay-per-view is going away. But the idea that you need big fight cards, I don't think that goes away. Now, how you differentiate them is very, very interesting, because a lot of them we're seeing can have like a great main event, a great co-main, but everything below that, you don't know the difference between that and a main card fight. So you might have to stack kind of the main card a little bit more in order to let people know that this is something special and big and different. Also the numbering system and all these things, where this is an official UFC, it's not a fight night, you're going to weigh heavily on that. But also remember, a lot of fighters, champions, had pay-per-view clauses where they got a percentage of the pay-per-view because they were champion, as long as they were main event or co-main event. And the contracts were different depending on the fighter. But what do you do with that? I mean, how did Conor McGregor make so much money? It's because he got a percentage of the pay-per-view. Well, there is no pay-per-view. So things have to be restructured in terms of how you pay fighters and how you make a marquee event if it's not a pay-per-view. So they're going to have to figure that out. But I think you're going to have some loaded main cards.
That you make an excellent point, because I've heard other people making that point as well. As far as, especially with MMA, which doesn't have an association or a union, everybody sees the benefit that UFC gets out of this. Everybody sees the benefit that Paramount gets out. Everybody sees the benefit that the fans get out. But as you clearly pointed out, fighters really don't get much of a benefit, besides, especially with the big name fighters who are champions, who's supposed to be getting that pay-per-view clause. So how do you think that is going to be shaped out? Especially like you mentioned, they should be restructuring, but there's no onus on the UFC's part, especially if there's no fighters association to kind of combat that.
It's extremely difficult. It's one of those things where I remember years ago there was an issue with pay for actors and SAG and all this stuff, and they asked an actor, like, why are they getting paid less and less? And they said, well, they're paying less and people are still showing up. And that's really how you have to look at it. If I offer you 10 and 10 to show up and fight, and you sign on the dotted line to do that, I'd be a fool to pay anything more. And the idea that, as you mentioned, without a union, without a athletes association of some kind, if you're not going to do it, somebody else is going to do it for you. That's how markets work. And the fighter pay issue has always been an issue that comes up every now and then in the news cycle for, fight media. But the point is, the fighters themselves have to do it. And, the MMA media and people who talk about it can complain about it all day long. But, it seems like the difficulty is fighters don't usually make an issue out of it until they're done fighting, right? And by then it's too late. By then they have no leverage. So it's always been the thing in combat sports, is the power of the promotion versus the power of the fighters. And that's always been the balancing act. And, when fighters get too much power, you get those down years in boxing where it seemed like the best didn't want to fight the best because they didn't have to. Well, when the promotion has too much power, fighters don't fight for very much money and they end up with nothing. So it's that balance that the fighters themselves have to find. And no MMA media, no MMA fan is going to be able to fix it. The fighters themselves have to figure it out.
Yeah, and we were talking about boxing before, especially with Dana White and his relationship with Turkey Al-Sheikh rather.
Yep.
You see the Zuffa Boxing is trying to become a bit more of a player within the global boxing brand or zeitgeist. So how do you see it working out? Do you see that similar things especially are going to happen now that Zuffa and TKO are trying to make revisions or get in touch with regulators and other like states or Congress people, our federal Congress people, in order to kind of chip away at the Muhammad Ali Act so that they can kind of bring their monopoly style that they have from the UFC and from WWE into boxing? Do you think that is going to be, TKO is going to have more of a push now that it seems like boxing is ripe for the taking now?
The difficulty is with the current way that boxing contracts work, partly because of the Muhammad Ali Act, The thing about the UFC contracts is, John Jones signed an 8-fight deal that's the rest of his career. He's not going anywhere. He can't fight for anyone else. He's never going to fight for anyone else. GSP famously retired from the sport, and it was, if you come back, you fight for us. There are no sunset clauses on the contracts, things like this. Well, boxing, the contracts are much shorter. You just can't lock someone down for 5 to 10 fights. You just can't do that. So the idea that the structural changes that would have to take place to make boxing fall under a UFC kind of model, that's what they're working towards. But with the current state of boxing contracts, you can't do that. So the idea of we're going to impose this kind of, league UFC type structure to boxing, well, in order to make that work, you have to have that person locked down for the entire time. A lot of, if not all of their prime. It's just a very different business. It works very differently than MMA. Boxing just works under different lines. So the idea that we're going to apply this model to boxing, well, they're going to try, and we'll see if it works. But the way the talent moves around in boxing is very, very different. We'll have to see how that works out in 2026. That's a big question for everybody.
That's true. And I was also thinking, as you were kind of explaining that you do have still the big name fighters like the Canelos, like the Terrence Bud Crawfords, who are going to be fighting one another coming up soon. You still have those big time fighters. Do you think those big time fighters, or those fighters in that kind of range, that either championship range or kind of like that fame range, like a Tank Davis, do you think those kind of fighters are going to be more willing to get into bed with a Zuffa, knowing that kind of the Zuffa model, how it's going to be working over time?
You can't make them sign an 8-fight deal. They won't do it. They'll just say no. The problem is that Canelo Alvarez and Gervonta Davis and, Dimitri Bivol, the big names in boxing, hey, sign this contract. No, I have hundreds of $1 millions. I don't have to do it, and I'm not gonna. They have a lot more negotiating power. The problem with, if you're trying to negotiate in the UFC, once you sign and once you're in, the system is essentially designed so that you never are a free agent at your absolute peak. You're just not. You're never in a position where I'm earning a ton of money, I'm doing everything I need to do, and I'm going to be a free agent. I'm going to test out the market. Boxers are always in that position every so many years, and so the idea that promotional contracts don't last very long, they're always up in their game and making more and more money. And the idea of sitting down with a Canelo Alvarez who has no reason to sign a contract unless it says everything he wants and gives him the exact money he needs. That's the difference, is that dealing with real boxers who are stars, who have already been established, it's a different ball game. They can command a lot more money. They can command a lot better terms. They take a lot more percentage of the overall profit made by a boxing match. All of this favors the boxer in a way that it doesn't favor mixed martial artists. And so, Dana White and Turki Al-Sheikh. Turki Al-Sheikh is kind of used to dealing with this environment, but it costs him a lot of money to sit down with these guys and make a fight happen. Is Dana White willing to do that? That's the question, and that's what held Zuffa boxing back before. It's also difficult to sit there with Canelo Alvarez and make a $500 million deal and turn around and give, Tom Aspinall $2 million to fight, right? So this idea of, and they are separate businesses in a sense, but the optics of something like that can be very, very difficult to deal with, and we'll see how it manages in 2026. It's going to be interesting.
It really is going to be interesting. And one more question that I did have on this partnership now, the new contract for the TV rights. How do you think this is going to affect PFL now, one of your employers, with them kind of being, it seemed as though, not exactly that they were second fiddle, but that UFC is just like such a big name under ESPN, is that PFL is kind of like ESPN's side, it seemed like a side project, but now that UFC is heading away from ESPN, do you think this is going to be a benefit for PFL? So now they can start airing more things or start putting more events on, and they know that they're going to get the primary machine behind them? Do you think this is a positive, a negative, or do you think it'll have a neutral effect?
Number one, it's a positive because it leaves the ESPN space, as far as MMA goes, all to PFL. Secondly, anytime a promotion says we're worth $1 billion a year, PFL can go, we're the number 2, we're worth X, right? This shows the size of MMA itself. But, the UFC has always been the 800-pound gorilla. They take up all the oxygen in the sport. It's very, very difficult to get anything done kind of in their shadow. And it's a positive for PFL. But PFL's still in a very, very tough spot. It's you're trying to make MMA news, you're trying to make MMA headlines when the MMA headlines and the MMA news is always dominated by the UFC. So it does help them, but they're still in a very, very difficult position when it comes to combat sports and MMA specifically, because the UFC is just, most people don't even know what MMA is. When you say MMA, they don't know what you're talking about. When you go UFC, they're like, oh, okay, UFC. I mean, they have a brand awareness that Coke would kill for, because when I order a Pepsi, people know what I'm talking about. A lot of times when you go outside the UFC, I mean, fans just don't even know that there is MMA outside the UFC. I mean, that's how dominant their brand positioning is. So the UFC moving out of ESPN does help PFL, and the fact that it shows how big the UFC and MMA potentially is with this $7 billion deal does help the PFL. But once again, they're still in a difficult position trying to make space in a market that is crowded by the UFC completely.
That is true. That is true. And it's a similar effect to WWE and professional wrestling. I think it was recently NBA All-Star Tyrese Halliburton, who's been featured a lot on WWE programming. He did an interview with like a pro wrestling podcast, and they were asking him, hey, are you a pro wrestling fan? And he was like, I'm a WWE fan. So it's kind of similar thing. Like that brand name is such a big, like you said, 800-pound gorilla that it's hard to get around that as far as delving into other promotions within that particular sport. So